One. Well, hello there, and welcome to the final of our webinars of the year here at P2. And it's really rather special one today because we're going to be talking about the power of data storytelling. And I'm going to be joined by my very good friend, Ben Clinch, who's HSBC's head of business data architecture. But before we introduce Ben, let me very quickly introduce P2 to those who've not come across us before. You'll of course know that P2 is the digital transformation house who was set up about 7 years ago to be a real challenger to the Big Four, and we continually deliver on our promises to our transformation partners to improve, to control and deliver on their transformation journeys. But enough about P2. Let me turn now to Ben. So, Ben, tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us what on earth does a head of global data, business data architecture do?
Great. Well, generally, I work with data strategy and data management. But if we were to break down sort of the key responsibilities for the team that I lead, we first of all work in acquiring business owners of data. So those are senior business people who are primarily responsible for an area that would produce or majorly impact a type of data that can be reused by the rest of the organization in various different ways. I find that really exciting because there are so many fascinating people within our organization, and connecting with them over the data that empowers their roles is something that I find very rewarding.
And of course, at HSBC, that's a pretty large job, I assume.
It is indeed. So we've got about 45 data domain owners, these senior business people in the area that I currently work in, which is the Global Banking and Markets, or the investment bank for HSBC globally. And these are global data domain owners. And we work with those individuals. We empower them with various different tools, strategies, and bring them together with their domain architects to identify the best sources of data that can then be leveraged across the rest of the organization, that everybody's on the same page with regards to that particular data source. And finally, we also do metadata modeling, which is sort of describing data and tagging it in a way that means that people can get the best out of it and interact with it in other areas as well as the area that generates it, so that we're really leveraging our platform globally and everybody's on the same page with the same data.
That sounds really interesting stuff, and we're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of the webinar, when we talk about what's coming, what's new in the world of data. But do you want to share with us a bit about how you actually got into this line of work? What's your journey been like?
Absolutely. Well, look, I've been in the financial services for about 20 years, and as a business analyst and later a business architect primarily. And what I noticed about all of those roles were the more empowered they could be by data, the closer to understanding the data that was driving those processes and businesses in which I worked, the better informed the decisions that I or others could take, and the more quantifiable the benefit of the change was that was either invested in or realized as a result of that. So what I certainly found that data was really the key sort of lifeblood of all of the business processes I interacted with and all of the deliveries I was involved with.
Really interesting stuff. So data sort of driving the business to a certain extent, and actually you start to realize the value of good data to a properly operating organization. And that's really interesting about what I think we're going to talk about today, because today we're going to talk about the power of storytelling, of course, in terms of data. And on the one side, you've got data, and data is a very real thing. You've either got it or you haven't. There's a chunk of data. And on the other side, we're going to talk about storytelling and narratives and the like. And one couldn't think they were sort of more separated, but how do they come together then?
Well, it's really unusual, and I'm glad that you point out it doesn't seem immediately obvious. When I went to a number of conferences and interacted with data professionals, what I found was frequently these were incredibly intelligent people. They really understood their domain around data, but a common theme of what they were saying was that they found it hard to interact with business people and get people engaged. I think it's easier these days than it has been in the past, but certainly back in the day, you'd mention the word data to certain business people and their eyes would glaze over. And which would be very strange to me as somebody who recognized it as an incredibly empowering thing to understand the data. So as I was exploring this as a thing, because it's not something I've ever really found difficult, I became aware of the work of Joseph Campbell, who is a comparative mythologist, an American professor, and he wrote he did some amazing research and wrote some really interesting things associated with a thing called the hero's journey. And so what he found by looking around the world at all of these myths and legends and stories that seem to have persisted in the human psyche more than other structures was that there was this common motif, a transformative journey in which the protagonist or hero goes through from the beginning of the story through to the end. And there are often very similar stages. So in many ways, this is a story for everyone and that they can relate to. And I got really interested in that as an idea of how, if these are stories that shape cultures and shape our understanding of morality, in some cases, our understanding of theology even, how can that story structure that influences cultures in that way be used to influence, engage people around data, which obviously I'm extremely passionate about.
So in a nutshell, how can you get people excited about the journey you're going to take them on and basically steal this concept of storytelling to drive them through that journey, essentially?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of many frameworks you can use, but it seemed like one that was already embedded in the way that we think.
Okay, well, why don't we take a look at this hero's journey? Why don't you talk us through it?
Great. So often it'll start, I mean, there are many, many different steps, and they're described slightly differently by Joseph Campbell and others who've leveraged it since. But effectively, it starts with protagonist in an ordinary world. And there are so many different examples of this, but The Hobbit is a pretty good example, I would say, where an opening in the Shires, if you will, where the protagonist Bilbo Baggins is living and is very comfortable with his existence in this ordinary world. It's something that's familiar to him, and then the protagonist usually receives a call to action. So to quote another kind of story around a similar structure, think of Neo in The Matrix, taking the blue or the red pill.
Very relevant in the world of data, of course, the old Matrix.
The Matrix, absolutely. It's all about the data. And then perhaps there's something around an anxiety of the call. Again, this is a motif that's often used, where effectively the hero doubts whether they are capable of being the hero in this, and often, again, like in The Matrix and say The Hobbit, there's a mentor that helps them overcome the anxiety of that call.
Classic Gandalf or even Obi-Wan in the old Star Wars.
Yes, indeed.
No, in trilogy anymore. Star Wars saga.
Yes, indeed, and that's absolutely classic. And in fact, in George Lucas, took the unusual step of actually quoting that he based Star Wars quite deliberately on the hero's journey, which is really interesting because often people leverage it because it's the structure that they've found elsewhere. But he absolutely quoted Joseph Campbell's approach in his structure.
Brilliant. So we've had our call to action. We've been approached by a mentor who's empowered us. What happens next to us on the journey?
Well, often there's something usually given by the mentor, which is often referred to as the mentor's aid, that assists the hero in that journey and helps give them something that's going to enable them to fulfill this quest. Again, I'm sure you can imagine how that's relevant in the data world. But effectively, beyond that, there becomes a point called through the threshold, effectively where the hero has started to transform to the point where or is in a situation where they can't go back to the ordinary world in quite the same way that they expected. Sometimes, the call to action was a warning that the through the threshold was going to happen, and other times the call to action results in the hero going through that threshold. But effectively, they've made that decision. They are going forward rather than backward on this journey.
On this challenging journey, they know there is something that they've got a struggle ahead of them, but they're going anywhere, essentially, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. So often there are a number of trials. There could be pre-trials or other trials that deepen the plot and obviously draw the reader in or the viewer in to these stories, but also. Again, there will be various different phases of the transformative journey, often characterized by those trials. The trials of Hercules.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or Odysseus in the Odyssey.
And then you reach the abyss. I love that phrase. But the abyss, presumably talking about the kind of that point where everybody is feeling totally worn out by the journey, can't go on, having the hardest time they've ever had, which I'm sure we kind of all relate to, particularly in 2020.
Well, absolutely. So, I mean, it's a bit that I love. It's darkest before the dawn.
Yeah.
Type of the challenges seem at that point maybe insurmountable, or too much to cope with, but often in these stories, which make it particularly exciting when that turns around and there is that dawn, and the hero is and associates get through into a brand new world that it can be, it's often described as a rebirth, or ultimately the transformation that character has gone on from the beginning. That means that they are now somebody new or something new, or have been changed fundamentally by the story.
And I think this had massive impacts on the kind of world of writing, because actually, as you say, it is such a universal concept. But you can see the story arc in so many stories that we've come across. So that's great if we're a writer, Ben. But how does it help us if we are a data architect or a program manager? How does that help us?
Fantastic. Well, first of all, the prevalence of this as a story structure is because we find it interesting. We can engage with it, and it speaks to each one of us in terms of, I think, as human beings, we're always changing. We're always engaged in change, and yet sometimes change can feel threatening too. And I think that this motive talks to that. So I spoke a little bit earlier about when we approach business owners of data, and sometimes they might not initially think of themselves as business owners of data when we first interact with them. But if we can understand at that point their ordinary world, if you will, what is their viewpoint? And what is their view around the business processes that they're interacting with, and the data that's going into those business processes or is being consumed by it? Where do they see themselves in terms of the value that other people are deriving from their data? Do they know where it goes, and how other people either are benefiting or could benefit from it? And really understanding their ordinary world is sort of the first stage, because then you can start to relate. You can start to really fully understand them. I would say, the next stage really is to get them excited about an opportunity. If you can establish that they are the correct hero, if you will, of this story, if they are the correct data owner, they're positioned so that they can influence that already, or are influencing it indirectly, then it comes the call to action.
Yeah.
And that might be thought of as drivers for change in other situations. So we're talking finding the drivers that are going to impassion these individuals associated with how they can use that or influence that data for the better.
I do love that idea, Ben, because so often you start on a journey, and then as you kind of decide where you want to take everyone, and then you go, right, this is where we're going. How can I get everyone excited about it? And then you start to go out to the business. And actually, this is entirely shifting that. It's basically saying, actually, it's not for us as the data owners, the program director, to kind of to dictate that. It's for us to create the call to action right at the beginning, so that these individuals want to take themselves on that journey. And I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about it. Really powerful way of thinking.
And in many ways, we're the mentor in that sense. We place ourselves in a situation where we help those individuals to become their own heroes.
Yes.
And by identifying with them, empowering them, and also then recognizing, we talked about the anxiety of the call, recognizing that they actually do have the ability to influence this when empowered in the right way.
Yes.
And actually make their existing lives better. I mean, the processes always run better with better data, always.
Yeah. And ultimately, you're not doing the change to them. You are trying to get them excited about the change so they can do it to themselves, essentially. So actually, as you say, they can be the heroes of their own journey. I think that's such a powerful concept. And I think the idea of actually thinking of ourselves as the kind of the mentor, apart from how cool it is to be thinking of ourselves as Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is obviously everybody wants to raise them. But actually, it's quite an important idea, isn't it? That at the beginning, we, as kind of the program manager, as the kind of the data architect lead and so on, we are the SMEs. We are the ones who can help them understand the power that exists in this world once they start to begin this change. But that's the end of the role, essentially. It's about empowering them, and then they can work with us to go through the threshold, and then to realize that the rest of the journey is kind of for them because they want to do it. And I think that's such an interesting way of then flipping the roles that we traditionally see ourselves in. Really powerful stuff.
Yes, and I couldn't agree more. It's about empowerment, and the data. I mean, where the analogy needs to continue is effectively there isn't an end to the story necessarily, or maybe there's a sequel. In this, the hero should be continuing in that new world that they've created. To improve the quality of data, and there's always things that can be done to make things that much more efficient and effective. So as long as they have the tools, they can do that. They can
take themselves out, and as the mentor, it's our job to empower them with the force, with the tools, with the blue pill, as it were, so they can take themselves through that journey.
Yes.
I do think the Abyss is also quite a useful mental model, because so many of the change models we're aware of will talk about this kind of journey transformation that then will, of course, have the dip, because there's always that bit in the middle where it all starts to get hard, things go wrong. You have to keep people energized and excited. And I do wonder how powerful this model would be in helping the business owners realize that's going to happen and keep going anyway. Now, I'm not suggesting you slow down at all, but yeah, it's an interesting idea.
And that is so true. And those dips could be, people being over enthusiastic and not necessarily being realistic in terms of setting their goals. And that's again where the mentors can sort of set, this is what we need to do. If you will. So, I mean, there are some really powerful tools that industry-wide tools that people can use, and some of those would include some of my favorites are the DCAM, which is a data capability assessment model from EM Council, or other data maturity models to basically establish what the ordinary world is, so you can actually understand also what best practices are. In terms of where you want to be going. Dharma and the data management body of knowledge is also is a very powerful tool in terms of supporting that. And then understanding people who've already been on this journey, either through consultancies who've assisted in that journey and have walked those steps previously, but also through hiring well. hiring people who've done this and who are going to be able to permanently also sort of support that kind of culture, but also understanding, data literacy. So if that hero needs an army to assist them in this transformative journey, then that army needs to be well trained, and they need to understand what it means to serve in that army, if you will. Data literacy is something I'm passionate about, in terms of understanding where people are at, and understanding how you can improve for different types of stakeholders, of course, because they don't all need to know, sort of the granular SQL or equivalent types of techniques, but they may need to know the importance of data for their particular role, and how they can interact with that most effectively. But also, I think there's some pretty amazing disruptive technologies also, which we get very excited about, which of course can help people through that. And then finally, the last bit associated with that sort of the abyss and rebirth is ensuring that the goals can be supported beyond changes in stakeholder management. So where stakeholders or sponsors might change role, or frequently organisations budget from year to year.
So it's that new world concept, isn't it? Actually, the world exists independent of the hero, and actually that's the end point, isn't it? Actually, you don't need the hero anymore because the world has been saved and established. And I think that's a really interesting end point.
That's absolutely spot on. Yes, and in many ways it's through the threshold, so that it's not so much that you can't go back; it's that you wouldn't want to.
Yeah, sure.
It's a better place.
Yeah. I could talk about this all day. Let me talk very quickly about the tipping point, if I may, because I think that's a really interesting point. How do you, Ben, know it's okay for you to step back as kind of the mentor pushing, and allow the kind of hero to continue on with minimal help? Do you have a kind of rule of thumb, or is there something you particularly look for? What's that tipping point for you?
Well, I think this is where good transformation practices really start to kick in. So if you know where you're heading, and you've set goals associated with that and milestones, then recognizing that the stakeholders and the project or program, if you will, is actually moving forward on its own steam and being able to use those program metrics to demonstrate that things are improving. This is where good data quality measure, as part of a structure of a mature data management approach, can really show things are improving. But then in terms of trusted sources, if you can demonstrate that people are now adopting those, and that people are advocating them themselves without you having to bring them to the table. So I think metrics is a great way, but it's also a great way of ensuring sustainability anyway, and that's continuity of hero, if you will.
I really like that. I love the idea of storytelling as a kind of way to help businesses kind of improve. One of the things I love talking about is kind of using the rules of the narrative, using the rules of storytelling to help design roadmaps for stakeholder engagement, and actually thinking about different parts of the business as almost characters in a story, and so people can relate with them. It's such a powerful area, isn't it?
It really is. Really is. And again, roadmaps I think are really great, because in many ways that's a mentor's aid that helps the hero understand exactly the length of the journey and their commitment associated with it, which again helps through that.
Superb. Now I do want to ask you a bit about kind of what's the cutting edge of data architecture at the moment in HSBC, because I'm sure you must get to play with some really awesome tools. So we touched a little bit earlier on sort of data quality and the like. How on earth do you manage that in an organization the size of HSBC?
Oh, well, so we have a really good data management approach associated with understanding what data is critical, and then best practice associated with data quality rules, defining that data in terms of what parameters are most important to measure, and what thresholds of data quality values coming back from these measures need to hit, so that we can determine that if it's above that, then it's within an acceptable range. If it's below that, then or it's trending in the wrong direction, then we can take appropriate action to diagnose and address those kinds of issues. So certainly from a data quality perspective, there's a mature approach associated to that. I get very excited in terms of new technologies with regards to knowledge graph. Is one of the approaches that I'm particularly excited about at the moment. It's for those who aren't familiar with knowledge graph, it's a form of an alternative form of database. In many ways, the technology has been around for a very, very long time. That relational databases have been used more widely in the industry. However, the power of knowledge graph is that rather than sort of just having tables and relationships associated with those tables, sort of almost as more of an afterthought, if you will, it actually codifies the relationship between data as strongly as the facts itself. So that you can use it in a range of really powerful applications to generate insights from data and diverse data sets.
Okay.
Can be sort of standardized through a common ontology. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to. I mean, it's fascinating. What are sort of the real practical applications of something like that?
Great. Well, metadata, the data that describes data, is one of the most powerful use cases I'm exploring with a real expert team on this. Effectively, when we've described data at rest in a system and data that in motion flowing between systems with the correct metadata, and we know what business processes that flow of data is supporting, then we can get really powerful insights into putting together complex data lineage. So that, for example, that hero can then understand who is using their data downstream. Of course, I mean they will know in certain situations in great detail, but others they won't know that other people are using similar data, but actually aren't using their data. And there's an opportunity to save money, to bring everybody onto the same data set. That reduces the need for reconciliations and potential breaks in processes downstream, where people are then having to take these two data sets and try and make them similar. So huge opportunities there, but also trusted sources where maybe, in organizations of our size, 2,000 downstream systems could potentially be using the data from one area. And then you can make an investment case to demonstrate that every buck spent on this system directly benefits all these thousands of systems and associated business processes. And that means that you can direct investment more effectively.
That's amazing. And it's called Knowledge Craft, and it basically helps you map out your entire data flow system.
Yes.
Powerful stuff. Really powerful stuff. Well, look, I could genuinely sit here and talk about this for hours, but unfortunately, time is slightly getting away from us. So I just thought I'd ask Ben, what's your final ideas? If someone wants to learn a bit more about the hero's journey, where should they go? Where could they start?
Well, there's a wealth of material, but one of the ones that I found that really gives a lot of background around storytelling is The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr.
It wouldn't be an Adam Smith webinar if I didn't get to wave a book at you. There you go. That's the one.
I'd really recommend that one. I can tell you already read it.
No, I'd highly recommend it.
But it also covers so many other structures that you can use, and I hope in many ways that it can sort of fire your imagination and those are listening in terms of how those structures can be used, way beyond maybe the ones that I've looked at.
Great stuff. Right, well, listen, Ben, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us today. We're going to share Ben's LinkedIn profile, a link at the end, and presumably you're happy for people to kind of contact you and give you a shout if they wanted to talk more about this?
Please do. I'd love that.
Great stuff. Well, listen, thanks, Ben, so much. All that remains for me to do is to obviously thank you and to wish everybody a happy weekend. Goodbye.